try to lead you. I will try to lead you through the overall thinking, logic, and of course, more than happy to have a debate at the end. The whole intention is that this would contribute also to the Global Resource Outlook 23, which is in preparation, and somehow do a kind of connecting dot also with some of the thinking which we will be doing on the policy recommendations. I will start now sharing the screen. I hope you see it, but right now, Rebecca, is it okay? All? I guess it is, otherwise you would complain.
Yes, yeah, I can see it. That looks great.
Okay, so I will start actually a bit in an unorthodox way. So returning us a few months ago to the COP26, and something where I think all of us could easily notice, that's the lack of resource and also the system change focus. I will try to explain you why and how. So first of all, the approach, I think it's one thing, sorry, just a moment. One thing which we can all notice is that the approach which we see in UNFCCC, it's mainly based on optimizing, improving the current economic model, which I think unfortunately will simply not be enough to meet the 1.5 degrees target, because a deep system change transformation is needed, and it's needed without any delay. Approach is addressing mainly supply side problems. As I said, it's focused on optimizing, greening, cleaning the supply chain, the goods and services, but in a way it's ignoring this need for deep system transformation, which would also address overconsumption, which would address the current overshooting level of planetary boundaries by countries, which I think it's creating quite serious, deep, lasting tensions among high-income countries and low-income countries, since the real drivers and pressures are not adequately addressed, and high-income countries are not held properly accountable. I have even heard the expression of zero carbon apartheid as being part of the meeting and the meeting approach. And I think that what I could somehow summarize, that actually the gap between high and low income countries is actually deepening and not actually addressed in a proper way. What we can see is that the low-income countries thus remain focused predominantly on the financial support, which it's important without any doubt. And but if core reasons for these transfers remain not well addressed and help is not provided in a more systemic way, then I do believe that what we will see in the future is just increasing requests for financial help. And I don't know how this will actually finally end. It's also happening in a kind of energy climate bubble, where many of the ministries who are dealing with the demand side, industry, agriculture, transport, trade, social matters, finance, do not participate, which also means that the policy options which are in their disposal are there not present, they are not considered. And while energy is the most important part of the solution, no doubt in that, an important part of materials and also nature-related policies and solutions are simply left out. And even when these are addressed, and I will go practically through whole my presentation following a transport mobility example, even when they are addressed, we don't really see that they would be addressed in a real kind of system change logic. So a Glasgow breakthrough in the road transport, which was announced, is basically aiming for zero emission vehicles to be the new normal, accessible, affordable, and sustainable in all regions by 2030. That's the wording which was agreed, which is, I sincerely hope that this will not become a new normal. But what we have seen also from the science which we have produced in the past is that most promising strategies to reduce materials and operational emissions are through the intensive use and making the vehicles lighter. So we can see the violet part in the column, car sharing and ride sharing. It's approximately 3/4 of the column. And if we would like to approach to those questions, not only through the car logic, but through a broader logic, then in the first place, there would need to be measures which are connected to reducing demand for car-based transport, reduce overall mobility need, then modal shift from cars to food, bike, public transport, and of course, higher utilization of vehicles through sharing. But also, of course, ensuring that remaining vehicles are sustainable as possible. So electrification based on renewable energy, which is actually the thing which is mostly addressed, and circularity, so maximizing value of the used materials. So if you look to that, that would be a kind of a systemic logic which is currently simply not present. So if I go back to our science backbone approach and logic, we basically talk about, when we discuss about natural resources, we talk about biomass, metals, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals, which you know very well. And these are called materials. Everything what is extracted from the earth, and water and land are also, of course, part of our story. And we have also predicted in our Global Resource Outlook 2019 that if the trends would continue, we will see the doubling of the consumption by 2060. So decoupling, it's our logical approach. I will certainly not go into detail to explain it because this is our bread and butter. But if we connect that story, then to the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is already trying to create a kind of a link to the compass, which I will start explaining on the next slide, then we have actually followed there a kind of a dual logic. On one hand, we are talking about increasing well-being per unit of resource use. So how to meet the human needs provisional systems in a best way by using less of the resources. And by doing that, we would be decreasing environmental pressures per unit of resource use, which is the link to natural and social capital, which are required to underpin the sustainable development. So that's basically pretty much everything what we are doing, which is leading me now to the system change compass. It was actually produced as an answer to the European Green Deal. And it will be a bit European focused, but vast majority of the things which I will be mentioning actually holds for practically any economy, because it's a bit the orientation which we would need to take. So the core limiting factor of human well-being and our economic development are, according to the Club of Rome, the unsustainable use of our natural resources and environmental sinks. And the report which we have produced, it's entirely based on the natural resource optic and approach. We see it as a kind of natural resources as a kind of a bridge. So the way we treat natural resources to a large extent determines economic results as well as environmental and health implications. So as I said, natural resources are kind of bridge between the economy and competitiveness on one hand, and climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and health implications on the other. So when we look to the European Green Deal, our clear analysis were ambition and vision, it's clear. So ambition, it's high, vision, it's clear. It's setting zero net emissions of GHG by 2050. And it's clearly also mentioning decoupling of growth and resource use. It also acknowledges need for fair and just transition, and it aims at strongly interlinked and mutually reinforcing policy recommendations. So it is really a kind of, I would say, historical document, which was for the first time on such high level acknowledging that economic and environmental developments go hand in hand, even more, that economic developments in the future to a large extent depend on that what will be our relation with the nature. But we found that implementation is rather uncertain. So we do believe that it's not sufficiently addressing drivers and pressures that cause environmental damage, that it does not offer systemic perspective to guide decision-making, and of course that implementation is also put at the extra risk due to the COVID-19 recovery. So that leads us to the system change compass. And I will now start explaining you the logic which is behind the compass. So in the first place, we dealt with a policy part of the space. So we have designed 10 reorientations, core principles, which are needed, where this compass is actually pointing. We have connected them to policy recommendations, orientations. This is still everything in the policy space. They are not concrete policy recommendations. It's more orientations where actually the policy attention should go and how it should be defined. And then in the second part, we have connected that to, we call it ecosystems, economic systems, which are really very much resource intensive, and on the basis of the policy of the compass orientations and those intense resource use ecosystems, we have proposed finally more than 50 most promising investment opportunities, which are logically aligned with the previous system change logic. So I will now slowly lead you step by step. So starting from redefining prosperity, from prosperity which is defined by aggregate economic growth to prosperity which is defined by fair and social economic development. Redefining natural resource use from prosperity based on natural resource consumption to prosperity which is decoupled from resource consumption through efficiency, sufficiency, and a shift to responsible use of natural resources. Redefining progress from growing economic activities and sectors to focusing on societal needs, human needs that need to be fulfilled without transgressing planetary boundaries. Redefining matrix from decisions which are driven only by optimizing GDP growth to decisions which would be driven by holistic metrics, including natural capital and social indicators. Then redefining competitiveness from massive dependency of Europe on imports of natural resources to a resilient Europe, which would be based on low carbon products, services, and digital optimization. Redefining incentives from incentives which are currently supporting status quo to incentives which are aligned with Green Deal ambitions and also economic ecosystems as defined later. From owning products as part of our individual identity in redefining consumption to experiencing and using products and services as part of individual share and also collective identity. Redefining finance from subsidizing and investing in old industries to supporting and facilitating transition and economic ecosystems. Redefining governance from a top-down, static, slow normative policy processes to a transparent, flexible, inclusive, participatory models of governance influenced and guided by science. And finally, redefining leadership from traditional leadership roles and expectations to the system leadership based on an intergenerational agreements. So now I will be sharing with you for each of those redefinitions the policy orientations which we have proposed. So we have tried to give relatively concrete but still policy orientations where the shift of attention of our policy should actually go. So when we talk about redefining prosperity, there is a lot of attention today on GDP growth. But in many countries, in particular in Europe, this is not the major problem. It's really the problem how we distribute the wealth and income which we are creating. So we would need to balance those two stories and ensure that economic transition contributes to equality and social fairness by guaranteeing universal basic services and minimum levels of income. We would also need to create through that conditions that we could actually create a space for social acceptance of the necessary transition, which is currently not there, so that we could somehow absorb even the full costs introduced through all economic ecosystems, which is extremely important also due to the other policy orientations, which you will hear later on that they are following. And we have recommended to replace part of the income-based taxes with resource-based taxes to address resource as well as social policy targets through that tax system. When talking about redefining natural use, our advice was to complement energy and GHG-related targets by introducing science-based resource use absolute decoupling targets following sufficiency principles. Assess all policy proposals through dematerialization and energy-efficient decarbonization impacts, and align current legal financial systems with circular and carbon-free principles and support the necessary infrastructure and research to contribute to achieving a carbon-free circular transition. On redefining the progress, meeting societal needs inside safe operating space, respecting planetary boundaries should be a primary goal of all, in this case, European institutions and national governments. Replace short-term based governance driving public, private, and financial policy decisions with a longer-term strategic approach and incentives. And reorganize institutions, governments, and other governing bodies and promote industrial dialogue to address societal needs and industrial ecosystem logic and enable addressing the complexity of challenge. So in short, to avoid a silo-based approach. When we talked about redefining matrix, replace GDP with a new comprehensive well-being measure that also integrates on the top of GDP social and environmental needs, accompanied by a set of additional indicators. Introduce natural capital accounting, standardize company and investor reporting with a decoupling lens against indicators of societal needs, pollution, and emissions related to production. On competitiveness, build European competitiveness based on resource, including energy, productivity leading to optimizing enabled by digitalization. Support the development and deployment of new digital services based or services based on other resource and energy reducing models. And finally, support solutions which will strengthen resilience and strategic autonomy of the European economy, provide new local jobs, and enhance education and job training programs. Which leads me to the second half, to redefining incentives. So follow the policy principles in all industrial ecosystems which would reflect, include all costs like carbon pricing or resource taxes related to environmental and health implications, so-called externalities. Replace without further delay all harmful, unsustainable subsidies, strengthen producer liability, and use freed up funding to support activities reducing natural resource use, especially of hard-to-abate sectors. And prioritize those investments which are going in rebooting nature. Update environmental standards to take into consideration systemic interactions between climate, biodiversity, health to ensure greater resilience to future shocks. In redefining consumption, we talked about educating consumers, providing them with information like product passport, empower them to informed choices. Explore the opportunity which is offered by less ownership biased younger generation and provide consumers with true alternatives to meet their needs. Support transition of governance, legal and financial systems to enable producer ownership business models. Then, when we talk about finance, what are our major policy recommendations? Ensure financial accounting and risk assessment fully disclose climate, nature, and diversity impact indicators of investment portfolios. Orientate all public investments to catalyze the system change along the lines of compass orientations and economic systems while considering immediate symptomatic actions which are of course needed. And support and de-risk private investment, expand blended financing in emerging industrial ecosystems and their respective investment opportunities. And the last two, the first one about redefining governance, support inclusive, informed, fair, participatory governance systems, ensuring that all relevant stakeholders have voice, agree, and share the ownership of necessary system change. Explore the establishment of international resource management convention and better ensure inclusion of resource management in all existing international agreements, and lead the implementation of more innovative, deliberative formats for policy making, especially at supranational level, providing development funds to promote decoupling globally through co-creating or fostering new projects, programs that are bottom-up, enhance governance models to support this implementing them. And finally, when we talk about leadership, our proposals were to build the trust through stronger commitment to and rules on science-informed policy making, based on credible knowledge from diverse knowledge systems on all governance levels, and better define how the precautionary principle should be used in practice to strengthen resilience and build that preparedness. Empower and support system change leaders at all levels, from private to public, from local to global, and ensure gender equality to drive the change. And finally, ensure that rights of future generations are considered in policy making and their voices are better heard and included in decision policy making debates. I know this is complex, I know it's a lot, but it's a kind of blueprint for a policymaker. What are the things which you have to put under attention? Then, from this overarching policy system, we shifted to the real societies and economies. So we call them economic ecosystems. I could explain why, but basically there is no need. We could name it also in different way. But the logic was actually to really follow human needs, in particular those human needs which are resource intensive. Why? Because these are the real reasons which we have to address if we want to address the environmental causes in climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and so on. So we have identified 4 resource-intensive human needs. First, nutrition. Second, housing. Third, mobility. Fourth, daily function and needs, so consumer goods, everything you wear, computer you are looking at. And after that, we have identified also some, we call it economic ecosystems, which are resource relevant and are in a way core enablers for those ecosystems which are actually meeting human needs, but are also resource intensive, like nature-based solutions, like energy, like circular materials, so materials which we should use in circular ways, and like all the innovation perspective, digitalization in the first place, which is becoming also quite resource intensive, in particular when you connect it with the energy. All that is actually pretty much interconnected. And all that is actually really following how to meet the human needs and not how to maximize the output of various production sectors. So, as mentioned at the beginning, I will follow the intermodal mobility. And on the basis of the logic before, so the policy orientations, the whole compass story, logic, and on the basis of these economic ecosystems, we have proposed, after quite thorough debate, which would be the major logically consistent investment opportunities. This is entirely open, and one can easily add additional to them. So some in the healthy food, in built environment, intermodal mobility, consumer goods, nature-based solutions, energy, circular materials, and finally, information and processing. As I mentioned, I will just focus on one, on intermodal mobility, just to give you a glimpse of the approach and the logic. So first, when we talked about intermodal mobility, again, we have first given few of policy orientations, recommendations, but this time they are very much specific human need in this case, mobility orientated. So we have looked at the impact in economic, social, environment, and resilience, and our advice was reduce the need for motorized trips and then through A, B, C, D, and so on. Reduce energy intensity and consumption of fuel made of mineral oil by, again, very specific. So in this case, we went really specific. Then maximize the utilization per vehicle and trip for freight and passenger through, and again, specific, and prioritize medium of transport that is easiest to electrify and maximize utilization through. And on the basis of this, we have proposed which are the most relevant and possible investment opportunities: fast charging infrastructure, high-speed railway infrastructure, modern and adopted transit infrastructure, car and ride-sharing models, end-of-line management of automotives, electric and autonomous vehicles, infrastructure to improve traffic flow and AV adoption, green aviation, green shipping, and walking, cycling infrastructure. As I said before, one could add more, but these are those we have been mentioning. So, in summary, you have overarching system of directions, of redefinitions which are needed, then economic ecosystems which are following human needs and are resource intensive, and supporting human needs and are resource intensive, investment opportunities, and for each of those levels, clear policy orientations, and also analysis of the major investment opportunities. We are currently working on something which might be even more difficult and harder. This is what would be the implications of this kind of logic internationally. Again, we are looking through the European optic because that was the approach which we used. But again, the logic and the thinking could be very much exploited also in other parts of the world. There will be quite important implications of this transition. One, some important flows will decrease or stop entirely. I would just remind you that in one of our IRP analysis, we found out that 50% of global trade in physical terms, it's related to fossil fuels, and 20% to materials. Just imagine how this would look in a totally decarbonized and also decoupled world. Then the second implication, stricter standards for imports might become de facto trade barriers. So at least in the short term, trade partners might also react by implementing retaliation measures. Increased imports of materials that enable circular and climate-friendly solutions will be also an implication. This could result also in price increases for those materials on global markets. And European exports will have less negative environmental impacts on downstream value chains. However, in the short term, they might suffer from reduced competitiveness. So when we look then through the logic which is inherent to Compass, we have proposed 6 actions which will be needed. By the way, this is not yet developed. This is in development, and this will be all still debated. And this is just a glimpse of the thinking and logic which we are doing. First, develop a knowledge base of in-depth impact assessment per ecosystem. Then promote efficient material resource use for low carbon products and technologies. Then identify synergies between European sustainability standards and low-income countries' domestic policy goals. Then reduce the negative footprint of exports and international subsidiaries in international subsidiaries. Then engage public and private finance to fund low-income countries' production system adoption. And finally, support technological capacity of low-income countries to champion low-carbon and circular business models. And if I would then go finally, last time, to the mobility example, we have identified also their very clear directions in which in the mobility, this kind of logic would actually need to go. And I will not go into detail now again, but just that you would see that we really follow the logic from the very beginning to the end in each and every one of those, we call it economic ecosystems. What would be the policy implications of all that work, and what will be the implications also, what are the implications that might be also useful for global resource outlook we are working together on? So first, redefining consumption from owing to using. Redefining production from mass sales to providing efficient functionalities. Redefining core economic incentives such as taxation, subsidies, public procurement. Integrating well-being as the objective across all policies. Measuring sustainability with a life cycle perspective, harmonizing all across policy areas. Activating existing financial potential to enable transition. Looking at innovation in categories of economic ecosystems that provide societal functions rather than in categories of production sectors. Fixing the governance and so on. The two which are mentioned, which are labeled threat, are basically some important things where we are already very thoroughly thinking how to integrate them in our Global Resource Outlook 2023 logic. How is that related to the business transformation in relation to this supply use? What if we would return with the logic to the beginning? The use of natural resources, materials, sits at the very heart of all the challenges. The way we mismanage them is actually the common cause of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution health impacts. So understanding that provides us actually with a clear message of hope that if we identify those root causes of the crisis, we can deliver policy responses that can tackle them effectively together. So you don't need to talk here about climate only, about biodiversity only, about pollution only, because by addressing the core issues, you address them simultaneously. Of course, in specific areas, you need more attention to different kind of production areas, production sectors, but still there is a unified approach through which you can deal with the problems. And circular economy can certainly be this response, at least if we define circular economy in a real systemic manner to reduce not only waste, but also space and material wastefulness of the systems, to see it as a chance to fundamentally improve the systems that deliver core material societal needs, the one mentioned before, and we should directly actually focus on. So policy recommendations which are currently focused on 2030, where I basically see the problem with that. Speed and scale of the vision and targets we have set to ourselves will not be met with efficiency improvements of more or less same economic system. And we need a system change. I have underlined that a few times already. What worries most in a focus only on low-hanging fruits and easy to deliver options to meet 2030 commitments. Why? Because we should understand that 2030 is just intermediate stage to reach carbon-free economy, to decouple. And this is essential in designing our policy. So if we will not start discussing more difficult system change related questions now, those Compass actually talks about, there will not be any more low-hanging fruits after 2030. There will actually be no fruits to talk about in 2030 because they will be disappearing from our attention. To conclude, science is convincing and the change is obviously unavoidable. So I think there is an ideal moment to move from the history, which was actually very much the history of resource-driven imperialism, into an era of more responsible use of natural resources, where we would collectively mitigate resource fragility and strengthen our preparedness and resilience. And this was also clearly position the work we do and give it a real historic strategic weight in our efforts for the transition needed in implementing sustainable development goals. So if we look to the 21st century, I think it will be pretty much marked with decarbonization and decoupling story. And what it's really an important question, in particular, if you look at in a global environment from relations between the countries, is to try to seriously look into the implications. What would that kind of trends actually mean globally for market players, and to organize and best prepared for that? Otherwise, we will simply hit the walls in those transitional efforts. The recent Dasgupta review published last year was, I think, very, very well pointing to the real important questions. They have actually mentioned that there are two core reasons why we are where we are. One is, on one hand, institutional failure, and the other, it's actually the failure of contemporary economics to acknowledge that we humans are embedded and not external to nature, and of course, to act accordingly. So for the beginning, we would need to answer only one question. Do we agree that we humans are part of nature too? And this is the last slide. If we have the problem of answering that question, I think the best advice, which I normally use at the end of my presentations, it's coming from a Belgium, the famous detective Hercule Poirot. Since I'm sitting currently in Belgium, it's, I think, a good and appropriate way to use it. When he was asked why he's speaking about himself always in the third person, he replied something like that: if one is such a genius like myself, it is very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. So I think that's the best advice to humanity. We have to establish a healthy distance to ourselves. We have to establish that healthy distance to the rest of nature, to the future generations, and start behaving with the responsibility which would make us really human. So thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Janez, for that fascinating presentation and very inspiring. Really, really great. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Paul now to say some words about how this kind of thinking is being taken forward by the Global Resources Outlook Working Group. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks to you, Janez, really challenging talk, and I think really challenging for the IRP, not just for the world and policymakers and all that, because it goes deep, obviously, into social science and the most fundamental philosophical aspects of, what humans are all about and what we want out of life. And that's not our natural habitat. Our natural habitat is much more the natural science world. But obviously, if we are a science policy interface, and the policy side of that has to deal with those kinds of behavioral and social issues, then they're ones that we will probably need to address more in the future than perhaps we have in the past. I'm not going to go into any sort of detail really about what GROW 19 was all about, although it's obvious that GROW 23 will need to build on that. I think it is just worth summarizing some of what Herman Daly calls the wild facts of the way in which we're using resources in the natural environment. That between 1970 and 2017, the resource use of low-income people did not increase at all. It stayed at about 3 tons per person. For high-income countries, it also did not change very much. It stayed at about 16 tons per person, so 5 times as much. A good reflection of the inequalities in the society in which we live, which obviously Janez was talking a bit about. For upper and middle income countries, it went from 6 to 20 tons per person. So that was where the real revolution took place. And obviously that's a revolution that may take place in lower middle income countries as well in the future. Of course, the picture is different if you look at footprints. In footprints, the high income countries went from 20 to 27 tons per person. This is all DMC. The low-income countries' footprints did increase from 2 to 5. And that takes account, obviously, of the much higher levels of consumption of resources in high-income countries than the territorial figures represent. I mean, the IRP approach to all that has been simply to talk about decoupling, to reduce resource use per unit of GDP, to reduce environmental impacts, absolutely. And that absolutely is now a simply mind-boggling challenge, because it means net zero of carbon, which is a very, very important material flow by 2050. And it means a regeneration of nature, which means making a completely different use of terrestrial space. That really, I guess, is what we will be grappling with in the GROW 23, how to reconcile those imperatives with the well-being implications. And we're kind of starting the GROW 23 thinking by saying, going back to the SDGs and saying that we would like there to be a decent life for everyone. That's mainly because everyone would like there to be a decent life for everyone, especially for themselves. Of course, that begs up an enormous number of questions about what a decent life means to people. And as I've been trying to get my head around the well-being and quality of life type literature of recent times, and there's been increasing focus on those concepts, it's still incredibly flaky and fuzzy in normal scientific terms. There is no real consensus about what resource use a decent life requires. I mean, just some anecdotes to illustrate that. I was very struck when Bill Gates published his book on climate change, showing that he was fully aware of the challenges, but a decent life to him means traveling everywhere in a private plane, despite the fact that we know the carbon implications of that. Similarly, when I look outside the window of my little council flat in London, I see a normal residential street in London lined on both sides by SUVs in a city that is probably has some of the best public transport in the world. So a decent life to those people clearly means SUVs. And then we know all the data about other kinds of indicators. I'm very struck as lockdown now in the UK eases. People can't wait to get back into aeroplanes and go off on their foreign holidays. So that's what a decent life means to them. So these are really tricky kinds of issues, and we will be focusing very much on looking at the provisioning systems that provide, first of all, subsistence decent lives. And of course, it's very apparent that still an unacceptably large number of people don't have subsistence decent lives in terms of food and nutrition, physical shelter, mobility, energy, water and sewerage, waste management, recovery of waste, what Janez called the circular use of materials, pollution control, communication, education, and health services. So all those things are very important parts of a decent life. Most of them have very significant resource impacts. And we've already considered some of that in GROW 19 with the modeling that was done by Cicero and colleagues, reducing material extraction by 25% below what it would otherwise have been, reducing greenhouse gases by 90%, reducing agricultural land by 9%, reducing global pasture use by 30%, and increasing forests by 11%. And it was remarkable to me that just about the only major lifestyle change in that set of assumptions that produced that scenario was a halving of meat consumption in high meat eating countries and less than halving in low meat eating countries. But that still produced global per capita material consumption of 14 tons per person compared to the 12 tons per person at present. But with the increased population, that meant that overall material consumption increased by about 50% more than currently. So that leaves us with a colossally materially intensive economy. And I think the question for GROW 23 is going to be, is that okay? Do we think that provisioning systems can cope with that from the natural resource base? Or do we actually need to focus more intentionally on consumption systems? Some of the policy formulations that are coming forward from members of the group are, do we need to put limits on floor space per person? We know that construction is one of the most resource intensive, one of the most carbon intensive activities. At the moment, rich people own many houses and very often many large houses, all of which have produced a lot of environmental impacts in their construction. In mobility, Janez was talking about active travel, public transport over cars, especially in cities. I'm up for that. That seems very sensible to me. There are huge costs in cities from congestion, but I'm aware that it's politically extremely contentious. And again, in the London context, we're having almost pitched battles in the street when people try to introduce low traffic neighborhoods. On diet, that was the one thing that was taken into account, but the policies that might actually cause rich meat eating countries to reduce their meat consumption by 50%, I think, have yet to be invented. And with energy, all the scenarios show that it's much, much easier to get to net zero if we can reduce our energy consumption, either through efficiency or by being prepared to consume less energy services. And of course, the project that I'm currently focusing on for the IRP, the materials financing, materials extraction. If we're moving towards a world of practically everyone owning 1, 2, or 3 electric vehicles, well, the material implications of that are obviously significant. So I was very struck, coming back to where I started on this, that very important part of Janez's system compass was actually redefinitions, was changing mindsets about what well-being is, about what prosperity is, about all those kinds of things, which is way outside our normal territory. But I think if we're wanting really to get back into the safe operating space that all the planetary boundaries and related literature suggests that we're currently heading way outside of, we may need some of that redefinition. And I think what the role of the IRP is in that is an interesting question. So I'll leave it there and go back and hope and look forward to some discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. Great to hear about how this can influence and be really kind of utilized and taken up by IRP science. And we've got some great discussion going on in the chat. So if it's okay with the participants, I think it would be great to have more of a kind of a live discussion. So if you've asked a question in the chat, then I will give you the option to unmute yourself and ask directly the question to Janez and Paul and engage in dialogue with them. So starting with Jeanette, who's got a question about material flows from developing countries. So Jeanette, I'll just give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, if that's okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, congratulations to Janez. Very interesting and important policy implications. I think it's important for the European Union. However, I have a point thinking that supporting this pattern of development would imply increasing material imports, such as minerals, for instance, for the energy transition, for the electromobility, and so on, from developing countries. As we are closely interconnected, if we don't also think and address the situation of the materials providers, we still keep social and environmental problems in the global scale. And for instance, we have a serious problem with unequal ecological exchange, among others, and also the problems that Paul talked about. And this is my point. I know that this is thinking in the European Union as a closed system, but it's not closed, it's open. So in other moment, it would be great to think in a more global system. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe hand over to Janez for a reflection on that question.
3 points to Jeanette. Thank you a lot first for your comment. I'm very much aware that this was analysis which was done through the European optics, and that making the same kind of exercise on a global level would sound a bit differently, but some of the fundamental orientations would pretty much remain the same. So also in the last slide, which I was sharing, I actually acknowledge that this international dimension is extremely important, and it's probably even more tricky than just looking through the internal optics, because it's opening many of the questions which are not only related to trade, but they are broadly related to international relations between the countries as such. But now to the point which you actually raised about that this will increase the material inputs. The whole approach and the logic, if you go through maximizing meeting human needs rather than optimizing the outputs of different kind of sectors. It's exactly based on how to minimize the use and need of materials in that kind of a transition. So likely, due to the developments which are in reality happening, you are right that there will be an increasing pressure. And that's why I firmly believe that the logic which was presented, it's an important part of how actually to contribute to deal with that kind of additional pressures instead of create them. And I'm a bit worried, and I have explained that pretty much already at the introduction, that many of the global related approaches like UNFCCC are simply too much narrow orientated. If they look only to the consequences on climate, but they do disregard that actually any kind of renewable energy option has some environmental consequences, some on biodiversity, some on additional use of materials, then they are simply putting under the carpet the rest of the problems they have to deal with. And what we try to do exactly through the IRP approach and through our science is to put those questions back on the table because they belong there. Because if we go only through the very limited policy approach to try to address those questions, the result will be that in 10 years we will deal with additional problems and questions on the top of those we are already dealing with. So if I give you an example from my life, which I have already shared with some of my friends, I bought diesel car some 17, 18 years ago. Why? Because I was an environmentally cautious person. Because on the car it was written that it has less CO2 exhaust than the benzene car. And that was driving me to buy the diesel car. But there was no information at all. Nobody talked at all about the NOx emissions which are caused by diesel car at that time. And it didn't took long, thank God, due to the Dieselgate affair, it came on the table very quickly, but it didn't took long that we recognized that this is really not a good alternative to the. So my point is, if you look only to CO2, you miss the other things. And I think that in many of international fora, we are simply looking too narrow and missing points which are simultaneously arriving and will become serious policy points in the future. And the point which you opened is one of those.
Brilliant. Thanks, Janez, for that. That was a great response. Paul, I don't know if you've got anything to kind of briefly add there before we go to the next question. Oh, you're muted, Paul, sorry.
Sorry, no, I mean, Jeanette, we're really, really conscious of these minerals issues because unlike the kind of basic metals that we're used to using in large quantities, these minerals occur in particular places. Very many of them occur in very sensitive places, sensitive environmentally, sensitive to indigenous people, sensitive in political situations. And I think my own feeling is that universal electromobility on the scale of current levels of automobility is likely to be another pipe dream. And that obviously electromobility is going to be terribly important, but expecting a one-for-one substitute between petrol and diesel vehicles and electric cars with the ongoing expansion in motorization that is happening around the world, I just think is going to lead us straight into another cul-de-sac. But I don't currently see any policy recognition of that.
Yeah, I think interesting thing to kind of watch out for in the future. We've got a great question and a great simple question from Edgar about how we get people to be really excited about this, which I think is so important. Edgar, I'll give you the chance to unmute yourself and add to that question if you like, but no pressure if you don't want to. maybe Janez and Paul can give a reflection on that question about how you think, what are the best ways that we can harness to get people, policymakers and electorates really excited about this?
Listen, it's the real question is how much can IRP do in that respect, and how much we can contribute. And I think with the work which we are doing, we are trying to do our best. How to get the wider public on board, it's more for the other audiences, but I think we should simply do part of the story, which is arming and alarming those who are responsible to get the public on board. I fully agree that this is an extremely difficult task, and but many of the things with patience and good work could be done, but not with the kind of approach which is currently a reality, which is basically bombarding the citizens on a daily basis with additional needs to consume and additional needs to expand. And unfortunately, this will not end up well. So the alternative of not going in the direction which we are talking about, it's pretty blur and not really optimistic. So I never would like to approach with a kind of black scenarios and that, but putting the facts on the table, it is part of our job, and some of the conclusions which will come from that are simply not good. But I think that the end game, it's pretty much in the incentives which we are sending to producers and consumers.
I mean, people are excited about the climate crisis now.
Of course.
So that has changed dramatically, and it's changed because the crisis is more obvious and it affects more people's daily lives. But I think people are also excited about some of the technologies which have been brought forward. I mean, people are genuinely excited about renewables and the prospect of being able to generate our energy needs in that way. Electric vehicles, people are excited about that, and they think they're great things. So I can imagine in going forward that people getting excited, both excited about some of the technological possibilities, but also alarmed by some of the implications of not going in these directions. What I can't yet imagine people getting excited about is reducing their consumption. And that's, I mean, a big problem in the context of resource use.
That's exactly where I wanted to end my it will be half a minute, not more. If you assumption, and it's the right one, is that producers and consumers behave rationally. Unfortunately, this rationality, which is based on the signals which we are getting on the market, it's a rationality for us here and now, for our pockets. This is the rationality which we use. But it's, as it is already proven, totally irrational on the long term, because it's causing climate change, it's causing, actually it's self-destructive, and it's causing also huge social instability and problems. So if you don't, it's a bit, I would do a comparison. It's like you would ask people to row against the flow of the river. And if you give them one signal and ask them another, they still row against the river flow. And until the flow of the river will not change, this will be the Sisyphus work. And I'm absolutely desperate that the signals are name of the game. And if we don't change them, row against the river.
Yeah, completely. Edgar, you've got your hand up, so I'm just going to ask you to unmute.
I'll take it now. Thank you, because I think you both have sort of pointed to the fact that the population is being bombarded with messages that are fashioned by industry to sell more products, right? And and the products are the solution to the inadequacy that that humans feel, and that is made worse by advertisement. And so, you know, having 2 teenage children, I'm really concerned about the way they have been swallowed by the social media, and it's just stunning. And I don't think it's good for any of the youth or anybody else to be swallowed by social media, but especially in that group, I think it is very disconcerting. And so I don't know how we stem that tide, but I think there needs to be, you know, I think that you know, this was a very encompassing vision, Janez, that you presented, that is relevant for governments and leaders and analysts and policymakers. But I think it will really take gifted politicians to sort of figure out a message that to bring the population along for these fundamental changes.
Completely, yeah, great points. Next, I'm going to bring in Jocelyn Blero, because you have asked a question about resource-based taxation and advances in that field. So I was wondering if you would want to come in and add anything to that question, and then Paul can maybe give a reflection on that based on his work in the field. So Jocelyn, if you wanted to come in on that question.
Yeah, sorry, your option to unmute myself came a bit late. That's
Sorry.
why it was opposed. Thank you very much, and thank you both, Janez and Paul. It's fascinating as ever. I think one quick reflection. First of all, there's a question of balance of where to act as well, because the system change compass, which is great, ranges from the very detailed fiscal policy expertise or technical, all the way to things which Paul picked up on are deeply linked with social sciences and philosophy, such as how many working days should a week contain? And these questions need to be tackled in conjunction across the board. And this is why the interdisciplinary work that needs to go around it is also very difficult to establish. But for Paul, because I could speak too long about this, and apologies, but to go to my question, yeah, Paul, you've been looking at these for quite a while already. You're probably one of the most prominent experts when it comes to environmental green taxation, to use a very loose vocabulary here. Have you seen any significant development when it comes to the acceptance, the inevitability, the rise in prominence in the general economic discourse of the importance of such measures?
Well, we've certainly seen it with regard to carbon taxation. I mean, if you just look at the way in which the map that the World Bank publishes every year on carbon pricing, you can see that it is getting more extensive. Having said that, it's glacially slow, and the carbon prices, by and large, are still very, very low, and not at all within the $40 to $80 which is kind of identified as being necessary. Apart from carbon pricing, I'm afraid the answer just has to be no, especially on the resource tax front. I mean, anyone who knows anything about environmental economics, and Janez touched on this, knows that the basic problem is that all these environmental costs are outside the pricing system, outside the market. They are real costs. They fall on real people. And particularly on real people who will exist in the future rather than in the present. But we've got used to not paying those costs as we produce and consume. And if we suddenly ask people to pay those costs, suddenly food prices go up, suddenly energy prices go up, suddenly material prices go up, and we're already in our societies suffering from inflation, higher than it's been for many years. And that everything in the UK at the moment is about a cost of living crisis with the energy, you know, and the extra health and social care costs that are coming down the pipeline, and a political message that we're going to increase food, energy, and raw material prices to a high consuming economy such as ours is unlikely to be accepted by policymakers as anything except an expression of insanity. And I mean, that is the problem, because we got used to these very low costs because we haven't taken into account the environmental impacts that they cause. And doing that will inevitably raise prices. And there is never a good political time for that. But the current time seems to be particularly bad.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, thank you very much. Hopefully we can, I think we hopefully can find ways to be optimistic as well as seeing the problems and challenges of this current time. Anders Wickman, I can see that you've got your hand up. So I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can come in and make the comment that you wanted to make.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, just to build on what Paul and Janez just said, I'm sorry I couldn't listen to most of Janez's presentation, but I've heard it before, so I know the top topics. But what strikes me is that we have had debates now for about 10 years about resource efficiency, circular economy, circularity. I don't know how many conferences every year. And this precise issue about the costing or the cost structure of the economy and the fact that we pass on externalities in the public sphere, which should be borne by producers and consumers, is an issue that is being dodged more or less all the time. And I don't know how many, detailed recipes people come up with regard to circularity. A lot of technical aspects, etc. But as long as the cost structure is what it is, and as long as secondary materials most often are more expensive than virgin materials, this is not going to happen, at least not broadly in the economy. So that's just one example that the issue that Jocelyn raised is so critically important. And I think even if I agree with Paul that there is little appetite among policymakers, I mean, we have to present this in a positive way. And one way to do it is, of course, to lower taxes on labor. That would be the logical thing. So my question is, can we learn something from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance? New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, etc. They have started to move in this direction by adopting other indicators for the economy and trying to steer policies in that direction. Can we learn something? Is there something positive to pick up?
Janez, would you like to come in on that?
No, remaining optimistic is always a good thing, and we have to. And I think we should present in our work all potential ways out. And I think one good message which I read from the chat is actually from Martin, which is saying that consumption is often placing commodity acquisition, which is actually the ownership as a center of the good of life. But I think there are so many good examples. If somebody would get rid me of being responsible for the fridge, for the washing machine, for the light bulb, for everything which is around me, that this would not be owned by me, I think I would be the happiest person of all. But what would it cause is actually incentivize the person who would provide me the service of having that they would produce the things that the fridge would not go in 5 years bust off, because that's actually so. If we can't incentivize producers, maybe with because of all the things which by the way Paul mentioned, which is unfortunate reality. Unfortunate reality is that if you get used to something, it's difficult to get used to something else which is not in your favor. And we got used that we don't pay those things. And but there are other things through which other models on which we should absolutely bet, which are if somebody would be selling me the 1 year of renting of fridge, I think it would look differently, because the fridge, the producer would be by incentive that he is selling me the service, and fridge is still his. So they would be incentivized that those would be produced in different way, work longer, repairable, and so on. And that's not any burden for a consumer. On the contrary, I think consumer is relieved from some of the difficulties which are connected with product ownership, and many of those things in our lives could be actually done and organized in that way, which would because currently the fridge is the profit of the producer. If he would sell me the service of cool and fresh food, protecting, it would be his cost. And if something is becoming a cost, of course they are incentivized to use less materials and everything. So there are many of the ways which we haven't yet started seriously exploring, but could really deliver quite convincing answers in mobility, in lots of daily products which we have. Even in housing, we can go that way. A bit more difficult would be with the food, but there are other questions which are behind. But I firmly believe that there are opportunities which are there without actually really exposing us consumers in a way that we would be in opposition to those developments. But yeah, there it's, I think at the bottom line, it is about commodity acquisition, because what we actually need is using them and not owing them. And as long as we stick to owing them, there is a lot of problem. But this is one way how to basically avoid the story of the price increases, which of course should alternatively also in one or another way slowly, steadily come through the markets. But there it's practically impossible to do the change without causing dramatic social consequences. And this is no way to go. So social story is the first story to be fixed before you start any serious environmental transition, which is linked to the incentives on the markets.
I mean, just adding to that, I think if we were to move to a properly priced resource base, I don't think we'd have a lot of chance to reduce our taxation in rich countries, because actually it would be properly priced because we're paying the full environmental costs in developing countries, which goes back to Janez's first point. And so these resources, they should be properly priced so that the countries producing them don't screw up their environments and get decent labor conditions. But if we were to then be faced with those prices, I think the nonsense of our current resource wastefulness would become immediately apparent. And all the stuff that Joss and other people working on the circular economy, suddenly that would start to make sense. And as soon as there are realistic business models for that, we could expect enormous innovation in the way in which we use resources, which would then be expensive. So we would be incentivized to use them sparingly, and companies would come up with all sorts of ways of delivering the services which we need and want at a fraction of their current resource use. Because the wastefulness is simply mind-boggling, the extent to which these resources that have been dug out of the earth and then with enormous environmental damage go straight through the metabolism of the industrial economy like a dose of salts and come out the other end almost without touching the sides. And that is such nonsense. And if we were paying the full resource cost, then suddenly we would find that the economy worked in a completely different way in its resource uses. And there would be innovation and new business models and all that stuff. But until you've got that price incentive, it's enormously difficult for me to see how that's going to happen.
Completely. Yeah, also Janez mentioned the decoupling review in his presentation, and I think that it's completely aligned with what you were just talking about there, Paul. Janez, you mentioned a couple of Martin's comments to the panelists. So Martin, if you would like, I will unmute you and give you the chance to come in on your questions and comments on non-commodity lifestyles and how IRP might look different if it went in a more kind of well-being based direction. So do come in if you would like to.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for a wonderful presentation discussion so far. I think however true our message is, it may indeed not be very attractive, as Paul put it. And therefore, if you then think strategically, with whom do you want to hang out to repackage that resource concern or sustainability concern to make a sort of future worth living and as an aspirational future? And I think that what Anders addressed, the idea that whole discourse on well-being, which is obviously taking on, is for us as IRP, I think, a really crucial issue. So how could we meaningfully relate to that? But then we would also have to think backwards. What would they like to know from us, or what could we offer them to reinforce their agenda? I don't know whether Paul and Janez have thoughts on that. What should we then do differently to be more attractive, to fit into that discourse?
My answer, Martin, would be that actually in the approach which we are currently trying to push through the Growth 23, we are trying to do as much as we can exactly in that direction. So to actually complement the GDP logic, to somehow replace the GDP growth with GDP level, because GDP at the end of the day, it's important, but also in the first place, complement it also with other indicators which are important for the quality of life and which are important for well-being. The more important part of that would be, maybe it would be good, as you are proposing, to connect with those well-being colleagues and actually have a kind of frank debate, explain them our kind of logic in emerging from natural resources and the worries which we have, but at the same time, the opportunities which we see in their approach, and also how this could be combined. So if this would be a kind of possibility to try to reach a broader audience and try to come closer also to the policymakers, we should simply exploit it. And but I think that the efforts which we are trying to do, which are not an easy one, if we are honest, are exactly going in that direction. How to basically better push the whole well-being in center of our thinking and logic, and how to actually replace the logic which is pretty resource destructive of maximizing the number of products which the sectors are putting on the market with the human needs and how we can meet them in different ways.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there are pressure points here. I mean, Julia Urquhart has got a lovely comment about how she wants to live in a city with no cars. So do I, and so do lots of people. But unfortunately, there are lots of people living in cities who don't want to live in a city with no cars. And I mean, in London, we've got a huge political battle going on now with a mayor who is systematically trying to get cars out of the city for pollution reasons and for health reasons. And it's a huge political battle. And it leads to pitched battles in the street over the lower traffic neighborhoods and all those kinds of things that are an essential part of realizing that vision. I think the food system is another one. I mean, we are seeing a huge upturn in people turning away from large volumes of meat eating in certain countries. And again, that is generating a quite different vision of what it is to be a human and the relationship with animals, livestock, all that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, there are these things going on, but they're politically enormously contested at practically every level. And they express very different perceptions about what the good life is all about. And I think, you know, Martin's point is absolutely right. That in a sense is the core redefinition. Janez talked about lots of redefinitions, and the redefinition of the good life, you know, what it is to be human and live in the natural world is a fundamental part of that.
So if you offer me one opportunity to contribute, I think we should perhaps invest more in what that could look like, because we keep pointing out why there is a need for something different, but why don't we invest more of our energy into concrete, attractive images of sustainable futures? It's always been a puzzle to me that we do so little on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't quite agree that we do so little on it. I've been aware of scenarios all the way back to Ernest Kallenbach with his Ecotopia, all the way back in, which shows my age because we're talking there about the 1970s. And I think there have been there's the Great Transformation, Paul Raskin's great book there with colleagues. I feel that those visions are there. It's just that we haven't yet woken up out of the deep sleep of super conspicuous consumption, which you know has been with Western human societies, at least all the way back to the Egyptians.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we're sort of at time now. It's a lovely way to end, thinking that the visions are there. Janez, do you want to come in for a final comment before we close the discussion?
No, but actually, I wanted to do another comment, but I think you're right. Yeah. It's we very nicely landed the debate in this 1 hour and a half. I sincerely hope it was useful. I think we would need more of that kind of debates in IRP, because that's exactly sharpening our edge, and also those discussions which are about how actually to better utilize the things which we are doing, how to organize ourselves. Sometimes we don't have simply enough time that we would discuss it in our regular meetings, but they're extremely useful. And in the context of the Global Resource Outlook 23, I sincerely hope that the group, those who are working on most intensively on those, have found that useful. At least I do think that this was very useful. And I would just like to thank you for joining me and the others, in particular also to Paul for accepting the role. And let's do our best, and let's try to use many of those things which we have discussed today also in our efforts when we are preparing our reports, in particular Global Resource Outlook 23. Thank you, Rebecca, for moderating, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you everyone for joining. Really brilliant questions. Apologies, Marianne and Julia, I was going to come to you next if we had more time on getting the recommendations kind of concretely from the report to what would be most meaningful for policymakers, and Julia on kind of visions of how we can live in kind of non-commodity, non-car environments. We'll share the slides and we can make the recording available so more people can benefit from listening to the discussion who couldn't actually be here today. So thank you very much. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you. And goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.